My name is Stephanie Loiter, and I'm the director of the Central America and Mexico Policy Initiative at the Strauss Center. This year, I had the honor of leading the Beyond the Border Policy Research Project. So the students in this class have spent the academic year working with FM4, FM4, which is a research organization and migrant shelter in Guadalajara, Mexico. FM4, FM4, provided 3 research questions this year. The first was, what was Mexican President Andrés Manuel López Obrador's migratory policy during his first year in office? The second question was, what has been Mexico's policy toward migrant caravans crossing through its territory? And the third was, how has the Migrant Protection Protocols, or MPP, a US policy that sends asylum seekers back to Mexico, affected Mexican border communities and asylum seekers? Now, to answer these questions, the students undertook various activities throughout the year. First, they conducted 4 interviews each with experts in Mexico and the United States. They also filed transparency requests to Mexican federal and state entities, and then cleaned and analyzed the data that they received. The group also spent a week volunteering at FM4 and spending times with migrants in transit. And they took a trip to the US-Mexico border to meet with organizations and agencies working on migration issues in South Texas. Another group organized a non-UT sponsored trip to the MPP tent camp in Matamoros to see the policy's effects for themselves. And finally, they wrote reports on their findings that are between 70 and 110 pages, single-spaced. The students also created 2-pagers for their findings, which are published on the Strauss webpage. You should all have the link in Carolyn's email from this morning, and I highly recommend that you check them out. I'm enormously proud of what these students have accomplished, and I'm really excited that they'll be able to share their findings with you today. For this presentation, each group will go through their slides back to back. At the end, we'll open it up for questions from all of you. At that point, please virtually raise your hand and Carolyn will call on you. Then you can unmute yourself and ask your question. So thanks again for joining, and I'll turn it over to Ethan and Anna to get started.
Hello, my name's Ethan, and I'll be presenting first with Anna. Today we'll be discussing our research in relation to Central American migration in Mexico. We will begin by providing an overview of Central American migration and its drivers. We will then take a closer look at Mexico's migratory policies and institutions. Then we'll discuss López Obrador's first year in office and the effects of his policies. After this, we will learn about the migrant caravans that have crossed through Mexico. And lastly, we will speak about the Migrant Protection Protocols and this policy's effect on migrants. Historically, people who were migrating to the United States were primarily single adult Mexican males. However, more recently, there has been increased numbers of families, women, and unaccompanied children migrating from the Northern Triangle of Central America, namely Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. These changes, as exhibited by the chart, showcase the increased number of migrants that have left these 3 countries. One of the primary reasons for migration is economic insecurity and poverty that exists in the Northern Triangle. These economic legacies have structural and historical explanations. However, today there are other factors such as low commodity prices, particularly for coffee, that have also lowered farmers' profits and left many unable to make a living. Another major cause of migration is gang violence. Gangs such as MS-13 and Barrio 18 extort small businesses and families and violently recruit boys and girls to join their organizations. Lastly, climate change factors into migration as a majority of Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador lie within what is known as the dry corridor in Central America. Recurrent droughts have wiped out farmers' crops, livelihoods, and food sources, causing people to migrate.
Now I will describe the institutions governing migration policy. Mexican migratory policy gives the following institutions agency in regards to migratory matters. As per the 2011 Migratory Act, which is Mexico's primary migration law, the Ministry of the Interior, or SEGOV, has the ability to formulate and direct migratory policy. However, in September of 2019, the Ministry of Foreign Relations was given authority to lead these activities through the Joint Commission for Migratory Issues. Under the Ministry of the Interior, there are two decentralized agencies, COMAR and INM. COMAR is the nation's refugee agency. INM is the agency that implements the nation's migratory policy by conducting apprehensions and deportations. INM has the ability to seek assistance from the National Guard, which is the country's primary security force, to support the enforcement of migration policy, which is symbolized through the dashed line above. Lastly, the Mexican Agency for International Development Cooperation, or AMEXID for its Spanish acronym, is a decentralized body under SRE that plans and coordinates Mexico's international development programs in Central America.
Anna and myself, along with our teammate Raymond Wyant, have focused on Mexican President Andrés Manuel López Obrador's migratory policies. We will discuss López Obrador's campaign promises first, his initial policies, the shifts in those policies over his first year in office, and the effects of those policies. Finally, at the end, we will offer some recommendations.
We'll first focus on his campaign and early administration, as the administration's rhetoric at this point was fairly unified. Three main focus points at this time were, number one, humanitarian treatment towards migrants, number two, safe, orderly, and regular migration, and number three, development in Central America. To elaborate on the first point, the more humanitarian policy approach partly focused on restructuring migration agencies through infrastructure and staff improvements. The second point refers to the administration's commitment to safe, orderly, and regular migration. This point was largely implemented through the use of the Visitor for Humanitarian Reasons cards. In the timeline in the following slide, we refer to them as TVRH cards for their Spanish acronym. These humanitarian visas allow individuals to transit, work freely, leave, and re-enter Mexico. They also provide migrants with a unique population registry code, or PURP for its Spanish initials, which grants access to public services in Mexico, such as health services and education. As the graphic on this slide outlines, the number of TVRH cards peaked at the beginning of the administration in January 2019 and dwindled in the following months. Ultimately, the administration halted the issuing of these cards, naming the program too successful and a strain on the nation's migration system.
Next, we're going to talk about López Obrador's development policies. It's important to keep in mind that the number one cause of migration is a lack of opportunity and the disparity that exists between Central America and the United States. For example, the GDP per capita in the United States is 12 times higher than Honduras, 7.5 times higher than El Salvador, and 7.4 times higher than Guatemala. To address this challenge, the López Obrador administration, along with his Central American counterparts, created what's called the Comprehensive Development Plan. And essentially, it has four main pillars: economic development, increased public spending on education, health, and labor, environmental sustainability and risk management, and migration management with a humanitarian focus. The plan is quite extensive, and it also includes 30 recommendations for the four countries, including ideas such as progressive taxation, limiting tax privileges for the wealthy, greater integration and trade facilitation, and an emphasis on energy and logistics, infrastructure, and regional digitalization. It basically boils down to a list of goals for the region. Along the lines of the Comprehensive Development Plan, López Obrador's administration has started two main development projects, Sowing Life and Youth Building a Future. Both of these programs are based on existing ones in Mexico that began since López Obrador became president. Sowing Life is a project that targets farmers in Central America. It involves technical training in agriculture, in-kind assistance in the form of seeds, fertilizers, and tools, and a monthly payment of $250 to all participants. Youth Building a Future is a very similar program. Participants, youth between the ages of 18 and 29, who are one, not in school, and B, are not employed, are able to attend weekly job trainings receiving $180 a month. The hope is that through these programs, Central Americans will have greater opportunities and economic stability in their home countries, reducing incentives to migrate. Now we're going to transition to talking about developments in migration enforcement. In early 2019, Mexican and US officials quietly convened a series of high-level meetings that led to an agreement on migration. This agreement cleared a path for the expansion of the bilateral migrant protection protocols, known as MPP, that began in late 2018. And a series of concessions by the Mexican government that would quickly unravel their humanitarian approach to immigration. Following the US-Mexico agreement, López Obrador's approach to immigration enforcement shifted dramatically. He replaced the humanitarian reformer at the head of the INM, whose name was Donatia Guillen, with the head of the country's prisons, Francisco Garduño. He deployed the former National Guard to both Mexico's northern and southern borders and throughout the country to support INM's increasingly aggressive enforcement and detention operation. These shifts in enforcement strategy led to an immediate increase in INM apprehensions, detentions, deportations, and clashes with migrants.
Now we will discuss the effects of López Obrador's migratory policy. We'll summarize how these policies have shaped crime against migrants, the way they have changed how migrants transit, and how the country's refugee agency has been affected by this administration. The first effect that we'll address is the increase of crimes against migrants, both by criminal groups and government agents. The types of crimes differ upon location. Along the southern border, the most common types of crimes are robbery, abuse of authority, extortion, and fraud. The types of crimes differ along the northern border. The most common there are murder, torture, rape, kidnapping, and other violent attacks. There has been a noticeable increase in the number of crimes committed against migrants by federal agents. As seen in the figure here, the number of crimes in 2019 neared the number of crimes seen during the Southern Border Program's peak in 2015. This is a relevant observation because this was another time of heightened deportation and enforcement in migratory policy. The most common complaints against federal agents are human rights abuses, corruption, and delayed or negligent administrative procedures. Next, López Obrador's policies have shaped the way that migrants transit through Mexico, both in the routes they take and their use of guides. Increased enforcement activities along the southern border in particular have changed where migrants cross the Mexico and Guatemala border. Migrants are forced to find blind spots along the border where immigration authorities are less present. In terms of guide use, data from El Colegio de la Frontera Norte, or COLIF, has informed that the use of guides fell during 2019 in comparison to previous years. This falling use could correspond to the granting of humanitarian visas, increased caravan usage, and a crackdown on INM agent corruption. However, the data is limited as it only contains information from the first half of 2019. Additionally, other reports from later in the year point to an increased use of guides, as high as 70%. This also corresponds with the increased use of enforcement on the part of migration authorities. COLIF survey data reflects a steady increase in the mean cost of hiring a guide from approximately $3,000 in 2012 to more than $5,000 in 2018. An anecdotal interview with a guide currently in business claimed that 70% of these costs go to paying off migration officials. Lastly, I'll go into how the administration's policies have affected the nation's refugee agency, COMAR. The agency has faced a lack of financial support, which in turn has created a great backlog of applications that directly affect those seeking refugee status in Mexico. The number of applications has increased exponentially, with up to 80,000 applications predicted for 2020, while the budget line, which isn't shown here, has remained stagnant in comparison. As the graph shows, the agency had 11,000 pesos per applicant in 2013. Now they only have about 500 pesos to dedicate to each application. This funding gap has affected COMAR's operations' ability to process asylum applications and their ability to offer integration services. In turn, COMAR has relied on the UNHCR to bolster its efforts. We will now address 4 policy recommendations. At the basis of these recommendations is a return to a humanitarian approach to migration. The first recommendation is that the Mexican government should renew INM's commitment to human rights. INM agents should attend additional training that prioritizes the rights of migrants and addresses corruption, torture, and abuse. Next, INM should reinforce its relationship with civil society and its citizen oversight group, the INM Citizen Council. Finally, crowded and unsanitary conditions at INM detention centers have drawn the concern and criticism from Mexican and international civil society actors. Mexico's government must address these concerns immediately by improving conditions and allowing civil society to engage in oversight and accountability activities related to INM detention centers.
Our next proposal focuses on the development projects. For any of these development projects to be successful and work, the Mexican Aid Agency, MEXID, needs to be transparent about their budget and where they're allocating resources. Currently, we only know how much money the entire program has. We have no idea who receives the money or where it's going. They also need to have clear evaluation methods so we can measure if their projects are actually effective. Secondly, it's really important that Central American governments are involved in the planning process. Both Sowing Life and Youth Building a Future were designed to be implemented in Mexico and not in Central America. While it's good that they're expanding, it's really important to include their input in order for it to be successful. And so far, there has been no evidence that there has been any sort of strategic planning between the governments. Thirdly, Mexico's development approach has been to create and fund new programs in Central America staffed by Mexicans. The problem with that is that there are already many organizations in the region that could expand their programs quicker and more cheaply to achieve similar results. For that reason, Mexico should consider fostering new partnerships instead of developing its own programs in the future.
Our third recommendation involves strengthening and expanding COMAR. The agency needs greater application processing power through additional staff and a greater budget. COMAR also needs a greater presence along the northern border of the country. Currently, they operate out of INM offices with no location of their own. Lastly, migratory law states that COMAR is the federal agency in charge of integration. However, the agency is stretched thin and rarely assists refugees with this. We recommend that the agency dedicate more employees to integration roles.
Finally, we recommend that the Mexican government reform, retrain, and redeploy the National Guard in line with the return to humanitarian policies. Members of the Guard should receive special training that focuses on migrants' rights and prepares them to receive and direct migrants in transit. The National Guard's role in enforcement operations should also be decreased significantly. Guard units should be redeployed along migrant transit routes and in areas of high crime and violence. Their mission should focus on ensuring safe passage and protection from gangs and others who might threaten migrants' safety. The National Guard's primary role in the country should also be countering violence and increasing safety for Mexican citizens and migrants alike. This concludes our section, and now I'll let the Migratory Caravan Group take over from here.
Hello, my name is Lucas Pastorville-Lee, and I will be discussing migrant caravans in Mexico. This research was conducted by Ashley Moore, Lucia Montes, Joel Carter, and myself. Migrant caravans are composed of friends, neighbors, and family members employing a method of collective migration to flee violence, poverty, and crime in pursuit of safety, prosperity, and solidarity. Recently, migrant caravans have motivated over 24,000 people to pursue group transit through Mexico. So before diving into the specific cases of caravans in Mexico, I'll start by giving a high-level overview of the demographics of migrants in caravans, the methods of organizing them, the various interactions caravans have along the road, and the routes they've taken so far. So when we're looking at the demographics, we'll start with the country of origin. Caravans mainly consist of migrants from the Northern Triangle countries, but also from all over the world, as there have been caravans referred to as the African caravan that included members from Africa and Asia. Caravans greatly vary in size. For example, the April 2017 caravan had 350 migrants, while the October 2018 one fielded as many as 7,200. Caravans are mainly made up of women, children, and families. Additionally, members of the LGBTQ+ community have a smaller but consistent presence as well. When organizing a caravan, one person is designated to lead a smaller group, and then leaders convene and communicate on how and when to arrive at specific cities along the caravan's route. Regarding communication within the caravan, word of mouth plays a large role, as family members and friends communicate about upcoming caravans and then relay information to those interested in joining. Of course, social media is a big player, as Facebook Messenger and WhatsApp have become important in forming caravans. Members form group chats and then communicate about details regarding departure times, items to bring, and what to expect on the journey. Transportation is mainly revolving around modes regarding buses and trains, but for the most part, folks travel by foot. Regarding interactions between caravans and other actors along the road, the first and foremost player to evaluate is the government. And that typically involves INM and Guardia Nacional. The National Migration Institute, or INM, processes, detains, and deports migrants, while the National Guard blocks the physical passage of caravans throughout their journey. As for local communities, their interactions with caravans vary greatly. For instance, the January 2019 caravan was provided shelter and food upon arriving in Piedras Negras, while the November 2018 caravan was met by an anti-migrant protest upon arriving in Tijuana. As for civil society groups, activists, leaders, religious leaders, and human rights groups provide support to caravans, and namely Pueblo Sin Frontera has been one of the most consistent in their support for caravans, as they were the first entity to organize them. Moreover, all these actors work separately and inconsistently when addressing caravans. There are many factors to be considered when deciding which route a caravan should take. Firstly, personal connections play a large role in deciding which route to take to the northern border and can cause caravans to splinter off. Of course, the presence of law enforcement and the threat of violence can cause caravans to take much longer routes for the sake of safety. And geographic landscape is also a consideration. As I mentioned, caravans are traveling by foot and are going to be looking for the easiest landscape to travel by such means. And this map shows the different routes that caravans have taken over the past 3 years. When looking at the Mexican government's response to caravans, we can notice one noticeable trend. Starting with a humanitarian approach, caravans were received with aid, security, and protective documentation on several accounts. Mounting pressure from the United States, enormous growth in caravan sizes, and changing administrations later led to more punitive measures involving mass arrest, deportations, and violent clashes with the National Guard. The following timeline represents the progression of both modern migrant caravans and the Mexican government's response to them. Caravans started as small social justice movements that lacked a migratory bend as their central tenet. As they grew, their purpose became explicitly migratory in nature. The Mexican government viewed early caravans as harmless social demonstrations and mainly left them to their devices. When they shifted to a migratory mechanism and attracted American ire, Mexico viewed them as a national security threat. So the first caravan of the Missing Mothers, or Caravana de Madres de Migrantes Desaparecidos, began in 2005 and sought to spread awareness regarding violence against migrants. In 2010, the first Via Crucis caravan rallied religious support to demonstrate migrant solidarity by replicating Jesus' walk with the cross before his crucifixion. The nature of the annual Via Crucis changed in 2014, when a procession marched all the way to the US border and coincided with the arrival of unaccompanied minors at the border that same year. In 2017, Pueblo Sin Frontera organized a Via Crucis of 350 people with the express intention of reaching and crossing the US border. It was at this point that the primary purpose of these caravans became migratory in nature, and they became the caravans we now know today. The following dates represent the 5 distinct caravans that occurred over the past 2 years. The April 2018 caravan saw both a leap in migrant involvement and a rise in regional attention. Mexican authorities sought to mitigate its procession by distributing transit permits, but was only able to cut the group's numbers by 20%. In October of that same year, the largest and most publicized caravan left San Pedro Sula, Honduras for the Tijuana-San Diego port of entry. Amassing 7,200 people, it was met by Mexico's Guardia Nacional at the Mexico-Guatemala border, but circumvented the blockade and continued its march. This caravan was met with mixed blessings by the Mexican public and was heavily scrutinized by American politicians as it coincided with the 2018 midterm election. 3 months later, in January 2019, the newly elected López Obrador administration tried to live up to campaign promises of humanitarian treatment of migrants by distributing humanitarian visas along the Mexican-Guatemalan border. The spike in this graph represents AMLO's humanitarian visa program, which lasted only a few days before being deemed too successful for over-incentivizing entry into Mexico. After such time, the program was cut. Moving forward, AMLO's approach turned punitive. When a new caravan of mostly African and Asian migrants formed in October 2019, it was met forcefully by Mexican officials and was not permitted to move north of Mexico's southern states of Chiapas and Oaxaca. The most recent caravan, collectively composing 4,200 people, attempted a two-pronged entry into Mexico in January 2020, but was met harshly by Guardia Nacional personnel along the border. Many were detained and deported, and those who were not had to remain in Mexico's southern states. This was the most punitive response yet and exemplifies the trend towards cracking down on the caravan movement. I will now outline our recommendations for caravan response policy in Mexico. In the short term, Mexico should expand their humanitarian visas program to include caravans. Currently, no protection specifically applied to caravans, despite the movement fielding many of the most vulnerable populations. Mexican officials should prioritize visas based on migrants' degrees of vulnerability. Those in need of caravans most will be granted their protection. This will also reduce overall caravan numbers, making them more manageable for officials and Mexican citizenry. Visas can be distributed at Mexican consulates so as to mitigate visa backlogs along the southern border. In the medium term, Mexico must codify INM's caravan response protocols into written law. INM does not currently have formal instructions on how to address caravans, and as a result, their approach is often ad hoc and discretionary, which leads to confusion, unpredictability, and misconduct. Mexico should define caravans so that relevant actors have a consistent understanding of them, and this includes delineating caravans by size with standard response procedures for each tier. INM needs explicit procedural law that is publicly available. Such steps will allow INM officers to function with more legal precedent and for migrants, advocates, and civil society leaders to better evaluate the validity of their conduct. Furthermore, the National Coordination of State Offices for Migrant Assistance, or CONAFAM, should have more authority in constructing Mexico's caravan response. As it stands, Mexico's migratory agencies and civil society groups are poorly coordinated. Without a central body to liaise between these numerous actors, Mexico's efforts are often inefficient and opaque. In order to realign Mexico's migratory agencies, CONAFAM should expand to all 32 states, establish a central office, and maintain a functional website. CONAFAM should construct a government and civil society task force dedicated to caravans that would include members from INM, INM Citizen Advisory Group, COMAR, Grupo Beta, and the Federal Attorney General's Office, along with the National Guard and representatives from NGOs and civil society organizations. When looking at the long term, Mexico should revamp its current anti-xenophobia campaign to include caravans. Those that do not know or understand why migrants choose to travel in such large groups should be better informed. The campaign has been responsible for authoring past reports to dispel stigmas and can bring critical awareness to caravans as well. Improving public perceptions of migrant caravans will allow migrants to get more resources, help keep them safe, and prevent future human rights abuses. Lastly, Mexico should allow Central Americans to enter the country without a visa. Ultimately, caravans must be voluntarily disbanded if Mexico is to have proper control over them. That cannot happen unless they are given a better option than caravans for their own safety. While Mexico's crackdown response has discouraged caravan efforts until this point, our timeline shows that such tactics are fueling escalation from both sides. By allowing Central Americans to enter the country without a visa, this will automatically guarantee a legitimate status within the country, provide access to regular, safe modes of transportation, and disincentivize the need for collective migration via caravans. This concludes our segment on migrant caravans. Thank you.
Now we will transition to discussing the migrant protection protocols and our research on its impact on asylum seekers in Mexico and the Mexican government. The group working on this consists of myself, Juani Torres, and my peers, Priscila Lugo, Emma Israel, and Jessica Eller.
The Migrant Protection Protocols, known as MPP, or Remain in Mexico, were the result of a negotiation between Mexico and the United States. The agreement requires Central American asylum seekers to wait in Mexico while their U.S. immigration cases are processed. Before MPP, asylum seekers were allowed to wait in the United States for the duration of their legal case. The result of the program is that there's a large number of asylum seekers waiting in Mexican border cities for extended periods of time. There are some exemptions to MPP. The initial MPP guiding principles state that the program is not supposed to apply to unaccompanied minors, Mexican citizens, and asylum seekers in certain quote-unquote special circumstances, which is not defined but is understood to mean people with disabilities, pregnant women, LGBTQ+ migrants, and others. Immigration officials at the border have discretion of who they place in the program, and so these exceptions are not consistently implemented. MPP was slowly rolled out from west to east beginning in late January 2019. The program began in places where there was existing infrastructure to carry it out and where it was easiest to implement. In the final two cities, MPP courts still don't exist, so when migrants are returned to Piedras Negras or Nogales, it is their responsibility to travel to a different port of entry for their hearings. They're required to travel from Piedras Negras to Laredo, Texas, and from Nogales to El Paso, Texas.
Now we will look at MPP returnees by month. This graph here shows the number of people returned under MPP each month since the program began. As you can see, the numbers increased each month as the program expanded into new cities through 2019. All of these MPP returnees have active cases in the U.S. immigration court system. However, MPP has created difficulties accessing the humanitarian relief they seek. Less than 1% of asylum seekers in MPP have legal representation in their court cases, and less than 1% have been granted relief. Of the cases that have been completed, 72% have been ordered removed. When we look at MPP by country of origin, we can see that at about 74%, the majority of asylum seekers in MPP are primarily from the Northern Triangle countries. These consist of Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador. As of March 2020, the highest number of MPP returnees were Honduran, accounting for 35% of asylum seekers in the program. This was then followed by Guatemalans, who are 24%, and Salvadorans and Cubans, who are 12% each. MPP guidance explicitly exempts various groups from the program, including Mexican citizens. But as we can see through track data, it shows that 69 Mexicans were returned to Mexico under MPP. Originally, non-Spanish speaking asylum seekers are also meant to be exempt from MPP. But as we can see here, as of January 29, 2020, MPP was expanded to include Brazilian asylum seekers, and there are now 359 Brazilian asylum seekers in MPP. Track data also shows more than 50 asylum seekers from other non-Spanish speaking countries. So far, the total number returned has been over 64,000 people returned to Mexico under MPP.
We will now look more closely at the effects MPP has had in Mexico. In regards to violence, the Mexican border states are some of the most dangerous in the country. The U.S. Department of State classifies Tamaulipas with a level 4 travel advisory and classifies Chihuahua, Sonora, and Nuevo León with level 3 advisories. A level 4 advisory from the State Department indicates that Americans should not travel to these regions, and a level 3 advisory indicates that Americans should reconsider travel. These dangerous conditions also exist for asylum seekers in MPP. This map shows the reported incidents of violence against asylum seekers in MPP. The data was compiled by researchers from the nonprofit Human Rights First, and the larger dots show more incidents of reported violence. Nogales and Piedras Negras do not appear here because, as I mentioned, asylum seekers leave those cities shortly after being returned in order to travel to the cities where they must present themselves for their court hearings. As you can see, Nuevo Laredo has been particularly violent for asylum seekers. MSF, otherwise known as Doctors Without Borders, has reported that 75% of asylum seekers that they've treated in Nuevo Laredo had been kidnapped, and that 80% of asylum seekers treated there had been victims of violence. In Nuevo Laredo in particular, kidnapping is a major issue, along with extortion. As an example, we heard the case of one father and son who were kidnapped from a bus station in Nuevo Laredo and held for ransom until the father's sister in the United States was able to pay thousands of dollars for their release. And unfortunately, this type of story is very common. Asylum seekers in all cities report being targeted for violence because of their identity as asylum seekers. In Ciudad Juarez, one asylum seeker told reporters that she was robbed, assaulted, and then targeted with anti-immigrant slurs.
Unfortunately, in addition to being targets of violence, asylum seekers have faced unstable and unsanitary living conditions in Mexico. All of the cities have migrant shelters, but as you can see from the data, their capacity does not meet the need. This results in people needing to sleep on the streets or looking to rent rooms where they can. Matamoros has gotten a lot of attention in this respect, where a tent encampment has developed at the International Bridge. Asylum seekers there are living in tents without access to proper sanitation, such as showers or enough bathrooms. In addition to that unstable housing, many asylum seekers lack access to work. About 56% of people returned via MPP have been given temporary CURPs, which are the clave única de registro de población that you can see here. These CURPs are the equivalent to Social Security numbers and allow for asylum seekers to obtain access to employment, healthcare, and education. Because many lack CURPs, they are unable to find work legally, which leads them to be unable to provide for themselves. The impact of MPP on Mexico has been quite large. In addition to the impacts on asylum seekers, the Mexican government has also taken on some of the financial burden of the program. Municipal governments have taken on the brunt of the impact of MPP. Governments have had to convert municipal buildings into shelters and provide municipal personnel to clean public spaces, as well as provide resources to asylum seekers. Cities have also had to close public streets to allow INM to deliver resources to migrants staying in those public spaces. This has led to disruptions on very busy streets for locals. The federal government has also made investments in support of the program, including the construction of shelters in Ciudad Juárez and Tijuana. In Matamoros, the federal government built metal pavilions and installed portable toilets at 10 camps. INM, the Instituto Nacional de Migración, has been responsible in filling some shelter needs as well, including hygiene projects and other resources.
MPP has had negative effects on the lives of tens of thousands of asylum seekers, as well as Mexican citizens. We have 2 recommendations related to the program. Our primary recommendation is to end MPP. Our research shows human rights abuses and denial of due process for asylum seekers, and we believe the best policy option is to end MPP as soon as possible. Negotiations to end the program should be done with full transparency and keeping the rights of asylum seekers in mind. Mexico should advocate for the United States to respect asylum seekers' human rights and allow them to wait for their court dates within the United States. We also encourage Mexico to immediately refuse to accept new asylum seekers into MPP. And furthermore, for those already in the program, we encourage Mexico to not allow them back into Mexico once they have gone to the US for their hearings. This would allow the US to slowly process the asylum seekers currently in the program back into the United States.
Understanding that this might take some time, our secondary recommendation focuses on addressing the most immediate concerns. In the meantime, we ask Mexico to address some of those concerns through negotiating that the US not return asylum seekers to cities where the US State Department has issued a threat level of 3 or higher. These cities include Nogales, Ciudad Juárez, Piedras Negras, Nuevo Laredo, and Matamoros. If the United States government has recognized that these cities are not safe for Americans, then they should not be sending vulnerable asylum seekers to wait there. Mexico should also negotiate that the United States define in writing who it considers to be high risk, who should be excluded from MPP, and then hold them accountable to comply with those standards. This would take away the officer's discretion and make it mandatory practice across the border. Finally, we'd like to say that MPP is still an evolving program and one which has drastically changed the landscape of the US-Mexico border. It will continue to change as the court cases against it move through the US court system. Policies in the US and Mexico continue to affect the lives of Central Americans and asylum seekers and migrants. Their effects evolve as different presidential administrations from both the United States and Mexico balance enforcement and humanitarian priorities. We appreciate your support of our research, and we thank you for your time. We're happy to answer any questions now.
Okay, everyone, so if you do have a question, please use the raise hand feature, and then I will call on you. Okay, Dr. Weaver, if you want to go ahead, please.
Okay, I just unmuted myself. Hope you can hear me. I just first want to say congratulations. This is an absolutely terrific project, and this was a brilliant presentation. I can tell that you've all not only put a lot of work into this, but you were really, really passionate about that, and that passion comes through clearly. And so I'm so happy to see all of the work that you've put in. I actually just have a very general question that I like to ask all PRP groups, and that is largely, first of all, were there any surprises in your empirical research that really caught you off guard and made you maybe rethink some of your research questions? And then secondly, what are some of the key challenges you encountered in conducting this research, either empirically on the ground or actually just working with a client or working with each other? So I'm curious about your overall PRP experience, if you could share that with us.
I'm happy to start on the latter question. You know, for me and for some of us in our group, the question about asylum seekers and how they're being treated and what they're going through due to both our government, the United States government, and Mexico, was a hard one personally for some of us. And, you know, we did make some trips to the border. We had, we spent time and listening to stories and volunteering in Guadalajara at a shelter. And I think one of the surprising things for all of us, but I'll speak for myself, is that it is very hard to relate to a topic that you care about so much, but also be that, you know, that objective writer and thinker on how we're presenting this information in the most objective way possible, knowing our history and our roots. So that was something that I guess I expected going in, but it definitely hit differently at different times, both being in Guadalajara and then being at the tent encampments in Matamoros. So that was a learning, and then also just our team. I was so grateful for my team. We all worked so hard and everybody was so invested. So one of the greatest blessings I think of the PRP in general was getting to work with such outstanding women. So that was great too. And Stefan Lutert, who was awesome as well.
I'll jump in with something that takes it on a little bit of a different tack, but I think this was the first time I had researched something that was ongoing and still changing. And I know I was sort of, my Twitter feed filled up with news about MPP like every 5 days, and there are these ongoing court cases, and the numbers keep changing of how many people had been put into the program, and the way that it was being enforced kept changing. And so I think I really struggled to try and balance keeping up with all the news, but also making sure we were sort of not changing our report every day when some new story broke, and balancing those two things was tricky and definitely a learning experience.
Kind of to add to that, I also found it was really hard when there were so many different sources of information that were mainly from like social media, or different news articles and in Spanish, and putting that all together was really difficult because there aren't many academic pieces yet about this research, and so that was a really big difficulty in navigating this type of research. I can also add from because we worked like with the federal government, there was this like bureaucratic perspective that we had to deal with. Personally, I interviewed the COMAR head, the director, and it was interesting to hear him give me these like very rehearsed replies and responses, even though I knew that they weren't necessarily the truth when we had other sources that informed us differently.
Well, perfect. I think if any other students want to add to that, you know, just if you want to raise your hand. If not, I think we will go to Elisa Santana. Elisa, are you still there? Okay.
Hi. A small request, is there any way that we can see like all of the people in the Brady Bunch style? Just because I'm still seeing the like question screen, and when everybody's talking, I like actually can't see y'all's reactions or like who's talking. There we go. Okay, perfect. Hey y'all. I love the presentation. My question was a little bit on the lines of what Kate said, which is, I wanted to know something that you learned or were shocked to have learned. I know that there were those who knew a lot about the topic before they started the PRP, and then those that had little knowledge. So I guess from either of those perspectives, like if you knew a lot, what was something that you were shocked to have learned in the process? And then the second kind of question that I have in relation to that were there any assumptions you had before you started the project, and what moment did you have that proved those assumptions wrong? And I'll mute myself again.
I can go ahead and take part of that question. So something that was kind of shocking to me was, I know myself and a few of us are from the border, but I'm from the Nuevo Laredo area. So the part of the presentation we were talking about where crimes against migrants are like especially egregious. And so it was definitely a little challenging to be reading information, and like shocking to be reading information about like my hometown basically, because I have such different connotations with that. Like I'm aware of the violence that happens there, but it's obviously very different, and to like see it happening and to hear people tell you like these direct stories about these awful things that have happened to them. So that was definitely like a really big shock to me as well. And then I also just like learned not to assume anything, because like Lucia said, we found a lot of information on social media just because it was such an evolving project. Like the caravans and MPP, we were finding out information from people that were there on the ground at the tent courts, at the tent encampment, that sort of thing, like as it was happening. So I made the assumption very early on to stop making them, like just to stop, to let myself like in my own mind, like develop my own opinion about everything that was happening, and to kind of take everything with a grain of salt, because everyone has their own agenda. And like Juani said, it was really hard, at least for myself, to balance the advocate in me and the like academic. So trying to be very unbiased in all of everything that like we were taking in was definitely a little hard.
Hi, Lisa. I'm Jessica. And I would say for me, learning about the violence that's happening, that Priscilla talked about and the presenters talked about against, I'm part of the MPP group. And knowing that all this is happening, these rapes, these kidnapping, extortion, all of that, so frequently, and it wasn't the immediate response of the US to end this policy that they know is putting people in harm's way. I think that's one of the things that shocked me the most about this.
One of the major assumptions that I had is that issues regarding migration within North America are an American issue, and from a very American standpoint. And I thought of the Mexican government and the Mexican people as more just being bystanders within all the larger migration issue and the larger crisis that's occurring. But especially learning about the caravans and mostly learning about MPP, I've really gained a much more clear understanding of Mexico's ownership of a lot of these issues, and the accountability that they should be held to, and the agency that the Mexican government has in shaping a lot of these issues, but that they choose to work in tandem because of a lot of the economic pressures and how interrelated those are coming from the United States. But it isn't purely an American issue, and that Mexico has a lot of decisions that it has made, and it has, and it's paid the price for that. So.
And if I can jump in, my name is Raymond. I'm on the López Obrador policy team. And something that I learned I didn't expect to learn is more like a lesson for other researchers, how much just walking up to someone in person and asking questions will get you answers that you've been digging for and digging for and digging for. Lucia and I had a wonderful experience in Mexico, in Guadalajara, where we walked up to a couple of National Guard troops after reading all the horror stories and having all of our questions. And we just asked them what we wanted to know. And we ended up finding out things that I'm sure the president would rather not have us know about how they're filling their ranks. I think for researchers, really the lesson that I learned is just like, don't be afraid to step out and maybe get out of your comfort zone and do something that you think is silly because it's probably going to get you a little more information, and you can start to break that open and dig a little more. So thanks for listening, y'all.
Okay, I think we can go ahead and move to Jaime.
Hi, everyone. First of all, I think it's amazing. Thank you for letting me sit in and listen to your projects. Congratulations to all. I think this emphasis on the importance of migration, U.S.-Mexico migration as a source of instability, it's a key way of looking at it, of the problem, and it's a different way of just the humanitarian, but also the security aspect to all. I wanted to ask a couple questions. First of all, I'm just going to give a little background there, I guess, just quick. For those of you who, I know, and those of you who I don't, I used to work for the Mexican government on these issues, migration. So my questions might be, very focused on the government part, just because working with the government is clearly different from working from outside, trying to understand it. But with the Caravans group, when you guys saw the shift of this humanitarian approach to immigration going towards a more punitive approach, did you guys find any evidence that it might have been caused by the capacity of the system, that it was probably just so overwhelmed with it that it had to change the way they were approaching the topic? Or do you think it was more about the public perception or maybe the outside forces of this?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. For me, I guess this ties back into Alisa's question as well. I came in not knowing anything about migration, let alone Spanish, right? And so understanding the political ties between Mexico and the US, how President Trump threatened Mexico with slapping on tariffs if they didn't put a clamp down on migration, really spurred a lot of policy changes. For example, the creation of the National Guard, right? In Mexico, how you see the militarization of policing in Mexico to sort of contain migration, for me was a shock. But yeah, I think that's a clear example as to why that shift occurred.
And Jaime, just to follow up, to answer your question, yes, to everything. Mainly, we could have gone into more of the intentions and the rationale behind the Mexican government's shift towards a more punitive response. Absolutely, the size and the growth of caravans could very well be argued that it forced Mexico's hand in many ways, that they're overwhelmed. And this is certainly combined with the fact that it was building public pressure. We looked at many different polls, public polls that Mexico conducted, that exposed the fact that caravans were growing very, very unpopular in some parts of the country. And there's a lot of political pressure that comes out of that. And then, of course, the United States, and especially President Trump, were making very explicit demands on how the Mexican government should be responding, along the lines of being much more forceful. So all of these coalesced into that. I wouldn't necessarily pin it to one, but there are many, many strains. And this isn't either to exonerate or to blame the Mexican government, but these are all the many factors that are kind of creating the blend of reasons for why they responded this way.
Okay, great. I think we'll, Dr. Weaver, please go ahead.
Okay, I can't help myself. I hope you guys don't mind me asking more questions. But it strikes me throughout this, you learn so much and you have so many good recommendations based upon really good evidence base. But of course, we're dealing in a political environment in which evidence-based recommendations aren't often listened to. So I'm particularly interested in your thoughts, sort of beyond the scope of this particular PRP, about how to take your findings to reach audiences that might be able to make a difference upon these policies. What is your advocacy strategy, and how many of you might think about continuing to work on this issue if you haven't become too cynical about the possibility of change?
Does everybody mind if I jump in on this? Okay, so we plan to tweet at members of the House of Representatives until they'll agree to meet with us. No, that's a joke from the project, but I would say that I think taking our findings directly to our representatives is probably a great first actionable step. We almost got Joaquin Castro's attention while we were down in the border. He happened to be there at the same time. And so it's an example of how if we're innovative, we can get their attention. And if we can actually get them to sit down with us, I think this is the first place. I don't think anybody on the federal level is really going to make a lot of quick changes. But I think that the House is a good choice, like getting with our local politicians. We have so many people in our course who are from the border. We have so many people in our course who are from Texas. And so this is a state where, I mean, we've seen, this is where a ton of resources are being spent. This is where all of these policies are coming to fruition and being played out in front of our eyes on our southern border here in the state where we all live and go to school. So for me, the first step is to try and get this information into the hands of those local policymakers who can start the fire at the grassroots.
Okay, but let me ask the tougher question, Raymond.
Sure.
Talking to Joaquin Castro, fine. He's going to be sympathetic already.
Okay.
Tell me how you're going to talk to Roger Williams.
Okay, so I'm going to talk to Roger Williams about the economic impact that this is having on industries, on agriculture, on, I mean, even the American economy. The border economy is super important, and this is having negative effects there. If what the White House wants to do goes through, this has serious negative effects for the Texas economy, for the US economy. I think you can also look at some of the smuggling data that Anna and I spent who knows how many hours in just digging and digging and digging, producing one line graph, but learning a million other things. And you can see in that smuggling data that these changes are driving dollars directly into the hands of cartels. They're driving dollars directly in the hands of violent criminal organizations. And I don't think there's anybody on either side of the aisle who would argue that that's a good thing. And so, I mean, with the folks I guess the folks on the right or the Roger Williams out there, they want to hear the economic argument, and we have those as well. So I guess I'd go that way.
Can I jump in? So for
Please.
MPP, the reality is that it was an executive decision. Like it's an administration order, right? That Donald Trump decided in secret with negotiation with Mexico to implement. So it wasn't something that went through Congress. It was really that administration decided to continue to prioritize the criminalization of brown people. And so the reality right now in ending MPP is that if Mexico, as our recommendation, shared, if Mexico doesn't decide to put a stop to it, it will continue until we have a new United States president. And so that, I think, what I see as our role now, and what I feel like my role has been in my work before this, has been to bring awareness to those that I can influence, which are my fellow Americans, like our peers, our communities, folks that are here and can vote, to recognize that, yeah, not only is Donald Trump terrible at, and this is where my unbiased perspective comes in, but really it's fact, terrible at addressing COVID or terrible at addressing XYZ, but also there's this program that is called MPP where thousands, over 64,000 people have now been removed and are not able to ask for asylum, a human right, over the course of his administration. And even during COVID, this very vulnerable population is only further vulnerable. And so bringing awareness to our neighbors about what is happening, because the reality again is right now, like the power lies in either the Donald Trump administration putting an end to this and retracting it, which they won't. They're actually now increasing the amount of programs that are stopping, again, asylum cases at the border and then sending back folks either to Mexico or Guatemala or other places. or Mexico sorry, I'm biased, but like doing more to say, no, put a stop to this. We're not going to accept any more asylum seekers. You can throw tariffs our way, and then we can put that back on you, America, that you're hurting your own people through this. So my role, I feel like our role hopefully will be to continue to bring awareness, to talk about more about MPP, to realize that all these immigration issues are tied together. And in November, we have an opportunity to vote this out and vote against it. And in the meantime, do everything we can to serve as that coping mechanism, like a Band-Aid for this, which is to help go to the border, to help provide resources, to help connect some of the asylum seekers with more legal aid, to help them with food and with care, which so many Americans are in the border, which were some of the groups that we got to hang out with and like work with, Angry Tias y Abuelas and the ACLU and Team Brownsville and others. So it is unfortunately a neighbor-to-neighbor effort right now as we try to help mitigate this, but it really is going to take a change in administration because that's what led to this to begin with.
I just want to add a really quick something, is that going off of that, I really believe we can apply pressure here in the US, but I do believe that, at least for MPP, it's all going to change with the Mexican government. And with everything going on right now with COVID, there can be a special argument made that it's in Mexico's public health interest as well, that they don't have a huge bottleneck of migrants waiting along their northern borders as well. Now that definitely throws a lot of what we have analyzed and proposed with Migrant Caravans kind of off, and we'll have to wait and see how that goes. But also we're going to reach out to folks in Mexico and ask for their advice on how to really reach out. And we're going to be presenting this information to FMA Cuatro, which is a migrant shelter in Guadalajara, tomorrow. And I think that's a really good question for us to pose that as well.
Okay, thanks everyone. I think we'll go to Madi.
Hi, I'm Maddie. Thank you all for presenting your report and all of the valuable information you found. A big congratulations to you all. I was wondering, besides the temporary suspension in US immigration, do any of you predict any changes in the MPP or asylum policy considering COVID?
I can jump in there because I sort of rushed to add a little bit about how COVID is impacting MPP in the last couple of months here. So, so when the US-Mexico border closed because of the pandemic, basically now if you are an asylum seeker arriving at the border, like at the international bridge, you're not, they're not processing you there. They haven't officially stopped the program. So Stephanie was mentioning a couple of tweets and rumors going around that a few people have been added to the program since then. But I think it's allowing the administration to shift towards some of the other programs that they had already started to ramp up before this happened. MPP, as we mentioned in passing, is being challenged in the courts, and a couple of courts have declared it illegal, and it's just being appealed and appealed. So the administration sort of seeing that coming maybe, and also in a broader effort to do as much as they can to prevent asylum, I would say, has started other programs where, for example, one, our Safe Third Country Agreement. So if you pass through, right now, if you pass through Guatemala on your way to the United States and then ask for asylum at the US border, the US can deport you back to Guatemala and say you have to apply for asylum there first. And so that's been, those sorts of things that are alternatives that still prevent asylum seekers from arriving at the border are more sort of doable with the border being closed because it doesn't involve you know, all the back and forth to the MPP courts and things. So I think those programs were already in existence, but the COVID-19 pandemic is sort of allowing for a ramp up of that for people who are still being able to make their way to the US-Mexico border.
I wanted to add in like the perspective from the Mexico's asylum system through COMAR. So I got some numbers from the UNHCR in April of this year, and there 949 people have applied for the refugee condition, and this is only 16% of what it was in April of 2019. So you can see like there's been a really drastic drop because of COVID-19 in Mexico's asylum system.
I guess I would just add that those numbers, we haven't seen those numbers yet for the US, but I think it will be really interesting to see April numbers for MPP and how many people they've put into the program since then, since the border closed, but also the numbers of people that are in these other programs that we didn't dive into so much, but they're still doing everything they can to sort of prevent asylum applicants from making those requests here in the US.
Okay, great. Well, I think that is the end of questions, so I'll hand it off to Stephanie to wrap up.
Just another thank you to everyone who joined. We lost a couple people along the way, but there was about 35 at the height watching the presentation. So it's great to be able to share this work with so many people in the UT community. And a real thank you to all the students for all of your hard work, for so many drafts of the report, so many drafts of the PowerPoint presentations, the 2-pagers. This turned out so well because of the amount of time and effort you put into it. So congratulations to all of you on being done. Well, we have one more presentation tomorrow and then we will truly celebrate. But again, a special thanks to all of you.
And really quickly before we end, on behalf of all the students, we really wanted to thank our fearless leader, Stephanie, for all the amazing work that she does and how she guided us through this. It was truly exceptional and we can't have imagined a better experience. So thank you, Stephanie.
And also, I wanted to tack on real quick that because this is public, we wanted to thank and encourage and send our love out to all of the folks we met along the way who told us their real life stories. And send them our blessings.
Yeah, the work continues, y'all. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.